The other type of disruption is right now the services and the DoD think of the budget as a zero-sum game. If you hear Frank Kendall and others speak about it, he says, my biggest problem is not innovation or tech, it's money. Well, I'll contend, no, the biggest problem is the lack of imagination of where to get that money. I would have thought when Russia appointed an economist as their Secretary of Defense, people would have woken up and say, both those countries are using whole of nation assets, and we're still operating like the rest of the country isn't involved economically.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweatt, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane, cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird?
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweatt. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Very excited today to welcome someone I've long regarded as like kind of the Godfather of Innovation in defense, Steve Blank. Need really no introduction. We're going to give one anyway, but I want to say thank you for taking time away from a bunch of just tremendously important initiatives you're part of to stop by the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Like I said, I think everybody probably knows Europe, but I think everyone is often surprised by the amount of stuff you're working on, sort of the criticality, a lot of them. Can you give everybody just like a once over, kind of who you are, what you're up to, and what you're working on today?
So I've been retired 25 years. I guess that's the headline.
Doing a good job of it.
Yeah, doing a good job. This is what type A entrepreneurs do when they were retired. The DoD stuff is kind of the bookend to my career. I actually started in the Air Force during Vietnam, 4 years, and worked on EW and ELINT in Thailand on wild weasels and F4s and A7s, and then I got stationed on what was then a Strategic Air Command base, and went from being able to do whatever you wanted to do to, they shoot you if you move on the flight line when they were moving the nukes. So therefore I decided I got out and started my entrepreneurial career. And just by sheer accident, I ended up in a halfway house between my military career and startup career in a startup with a PhD mathematician named Bill Perry, who eventually became the SecDev, or first head of R&E, or what was close to R&E. And then, but then I did 8 startups in Silicon Valley, supercomputers, 2 semiconductor companies, enterprise software, video games. Attention deficit disorder had its benefits at the time. And then when I retired, I got lucky enough seriously to retire when I was 45, started thinking about the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship. In the 20th century, it's hard to believe, but people told us that startups were simply smaller versions of large companies and do everything a large organization did, which in hindsight seems ludicrous, but no one had given much thought. I mean, there had been 100 years of thinking about how to build tools and technologies for large organizations, whether they were the DoD or a Fortune 1000 company, but no one had really given a thought about what was the structure and nature of how to build early stage and disruptive ventures. And so my work, someone named Eric Ries and Alexander Osterwalder, essentially created the foundation of modern entrepreneurship, which said it became something called the lean methodology, lean startup methodology, that says, no, all you're starting with is a series of untested hypotheses, and you want to probably build minimum viable products, and you want to test things and build them incrementally and iteratively rather than with a waterfall design. Note to F-35 and Ford class carrier designers, might be useful. And so that kind of caught on in the last 20 years. But then, post Snowden, I got sucked back into the national security space, the couple of agencies, and then the DoD. Then I met 2 ex-Army colonels, Pete Newell, who ran the Rapid Equipping Force, that is the disruptive organization that put solutions or understood battlefield problems and then rapidly scour the country and put solutions out on the battlefield. And then Colonel Joe Felter, who was ex-Special Forces teaching at West Point and then Stanford. And we adopted one of the classes I had built for the National Science Foundation called iCore, and we created Hacking for Defense, which basically takes problems from the DoD and the IC and hands them to students, teams of students. And what started in a Stanford class is now in 60 universities, multiple countries. And then from there, it was pretty obvious to us that Silicon Valley was at the intersection of disruptive change in the DoD, where for the first time ever, the DoD no longer owned exclusive access to all the technologies needed to deter or win a war, whether it was AI, machine learning, autonomy, commercial access to space, cyber. I mean, go through the list. The only few things are now exclusively to the DoD, whether it's hypersonics or nukes or exquisite sensors or complicated integration. But the rest is you can order it on Amazon. Go see DJI and the drones. But the other thing we observed is that we had world-class policy faculty and students. And most importantly, this now is why I gave the long soliloquy about the innovation methodology, is that we actually understood how to deliver things with speed and urgency, which was clearly not in the DNA of a DoD that for the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years kind of atrophied as the acquisition process narrowed down to a limited number of vendors. We ended up working at their clock speed, which was just fine when we were dealing with non-nation states like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but not fine when we were dealing with China in particular, who in fact, China operates like Silicon Valley, and on a good day, the DoD operates like General Motors. And I'm not talking about that we don't have world-class people. In fact, my observation is the DoD has world-class people and world-class organizations, seriously, but it's for a world that no longer exists. And the problem is our processes and our thinking and our organizational design hasn't matched the world as it is. We still want it to be the world that we wish it was. And that's a top to bottom problem. And we could talk about why and what goes on and the things we've been doing and whether we'll do enough of them in time as the world keeps throwing new things at us. What was your question? You could start with who are you? I think it started with who are you?
I love the point though about the elegant simplicity of, and you didn't refer to it as such, but just the enduring sort of utility of simple scientific method in everything we do, right? And bringing that type of the intellectual sort of resilience to be able to understand that, hey, I'm going to build hypotheses, I'm going to test. Not all of them are going to work or be found out to be true. That is a good thing. And I'm going to continue to sort of iterate and get better. So we see that type of behavior occur a lot sort of outside of, larger bureaucracies. You made the sort of DoD to GM example, independent of, great people, passionate people, mission-oriented people. Where do you think you build in or start? And I guess this is more of like an organizational change. Where do you start in that, right? Because is that at the Hill? Is that in the White House, the NSC? Is that in the building for, as we look to the future, the next sort of team that comes in? How do we think about changing that, how they do the business of the business in defense right now?
I'll eventually answer your question, but it's kind of interesting to go back to the root cause, which, by the way, to me it was really a surprise, having spent most of my career in the commercial world, reintegrating into the defense world and understanding that everything about rational behavior in acquisition and purchasing and thinking doesn't really apply to the DoD, and not because it's irrational, but we need to remind ourselves that the way we buy things and plan things were built for a world that had two characteristics that no longer exist. One is that technology changes, that as shifts in technology happened on a relatively predictable basis, and that the threats were kind of running at our own clock speed or slower. So during the Cold War, even though we had radically different systems, the US and the Soviet Union were kind of pacing each other. I mean, we would get ahead, then they would get ahead. We'd have an offset strategy. They'd build 10,000 more tanks in Eastern Europe and blah, blah, blah. That's no longer true. You can't predict technology. Anybody tells you, I know gee, I'm like putting in the 2045 shipbuilding plan, to someone in Silicon Valley, that's ludicrous. You have no idea whether we're going to have ships. And I'm only being facetious, but you really can't predict technology out that far anymore. The second is the nature of the threats. Who would have predicted that a third world nation would shut down Red Sea shipping? We kind of assumed it would be Iran in the Red Sea. Now they're
Yep.
using proxies. Like, so what do we do? Go into Yemen? I don't think so. Well, we intercept $20,000 drones with $1 million SM-3s? Sounds like that's the current plan. Um, and again, it's not because no one's dumb. It's because the nature of the threats that are coming at us and the rapid shift to technology no longer matches the requirements-based acquisition system, the whole PBE and whatever. It's not that we need to reform. I'm now going to just do a sidebar. We want to reform the PBE. Good luck. I think Washington was unhappy with the boat he got across the Delaware and wanted to reform it there. Um, but in fact, it's the nature of the fact that we start with a requirement which really requires a second of introspection. A requirement assumes that you understand the problem and you understand the solution and you're ready to commit massive amounts of dollars, at least for a major defense acquisition program. And supposedly we have a JCDIS problem, and a budgeting process and whatever, but very little of it is structured for these rapid changes that are occurring outside of the DoD. And remember, if I'm writing a requirement, who do I talk to? I talk to my existing primes, I talk to my service labs and FFRDCs and UARCs and whatever. Well, that's not where the stuff is happening anymore. It's not that primes are stupid or need to go away. If they're essential to national security. But in fact, if you ask Lockheed, can you pay $1 million salaries plus for AI people? They'll laugh at you hysterically. But that's what my students are getting to join AI startups. So we just need to admit that some of those talents don't exist in the traditional places that we used to have them. Yet we haven't built a system to actually integrate them. And I'll talk more about that and why it's broken and why the structure we built in the services and the DoD just has a really hard time dealing with rapid change because we didn't build structures to do that. And remember, in a 3 million person organization, it's, probably outside of China, it's one of the largest org charts we'll ever see.
Absolutely.
You
How
need,
do you think about the incentives
well,
of the
all right.
leaders and all of that?
So, all right. So let me go through maybe my mental model that I've been trying to figure out about, why is it hard for the services to ignore disruption or delay it or have a hard time adopting it. Where the world, I have one other foot in Silicon Valley, that's what we eat for breakfast. We eat tough problems and rapid delivery and experimentation. That is our DNA. And where you go into service, that's really tough. And so let me just kind of put in context some of the issues. So for me, disruption, this thing that everybody uses along with this nebulous word innovation, takes lots of forms, right? It could start with a disruptive technology. In the past, it could have been radar or nuclear power or computing or GPS. Today, it includes AI and autonomy and quantum and cyber and hypersonics and low-cost access to space. But a technology isn't a weapon system, all right? These technologies often lead to a new class of weapon system. In the past, this stuff led to guided missiles and nuclear navy and Aegis in the Navy, anti-air warfare. But today, they lead to autonomous drones, hypersonic missiles, cyber weapons, etc. But that's still not the way you win a war because these new weapon systems can create new concepts of operation that change or downgrade existing missions or create new missions. Um, in the past, that was guided missiles replaced guns. Carrier strike groups diminished the role of battleships, particularly, the morning of December 8th, 1941. Today it's the potential, again, I'll just pick on the Navy because I'm right now a little deep into it, hybrid fleets. We're watching sea denial via asymmetric attacks, but it could be via cyber, not only low-cost drones or precision hypersonic strikes, or denial of space assets, and which what I mean by that is not only ISR, but all the precision navigation and timing stuff we expect from GPS and other assets. Now, Now that's kind of how disruption kind of filters down from tech into operating concepts. But the other type of disruption is right now the services and the DoD think of the budget as a zero-sum game, right? If you hear Frank Kendall and others speak about, he says, my biggest problem is not innovation or tech, it's money. Well, I'll contend, no, the biggest problem is the lack of imagination of where to get that money. Because no one has noticed that China's been doing this for a decade, but I would have thought when Russia appointed an economist as their Secretary of Defense, people would have woken up and say, wait a minute, both those countries are using whole of nation assets, and we're still operating like the rest of the country isn't involved economically. And what I mean by that is, with sufficient imagination, we could get external funding for DoD projects. In fact, I'll explain it already happens, but by accident. And what I mean by that is new business models, contractor owned, contractor operated stuff. When the Navy ran Task Force 59, the autonomous ISR experiment, it turned out they didn't buy those sail drones, they bought the data. Um, and again, you can't do a lot of these things in wartime, but you could sure do a lot of cheap experimentation by scraping together some dollars rather than trying to get something in the palm that'll take another 3 years before the dollars show up. Um, but we really haven't thought about creating new facilities about, what would private equity, not private venture capital, but private equity folks who invest tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in projects. What would it take to change the tax law to get them in building new shipyards of the 21st century or new drone factories? And if you think that's a crazy idea, I'm going to remind you the largest manufacturer of satellites in the world, 1,500 a year, is a private company who's figured out how to have a commercial business model, Starlink, pay for the rest of their business. And now the military has discovered, oh, I could actually piggyback on those satellites and create Starshield without even thinking that this is in fact a virtual adder to the DoD budget. Imagine we actually had the imagination to do that at scale. So that's one more thing about disruption. And the last piece is that our peacetime process or our processes today, I said this multiple times, lack urgency for rapid deployment by a specific date. We talk about 2027, but we still put in plans for 2045. And it's like, and if you ask the folks in the Red Sea, the Fifth Fleet, like, is it 2027? No, it's yesterday. It's like, so, and then you go look at, well, how does this stuff turn into deployable weapons or concepts? And I think historically there's been 4 ways to do this in the DoD, and we'll talk about what leadership should do now. One is top-down influence by senior, military leaders or civilians. In the past, it was the creation of combatant commands, was basically driven by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Congress. Today, it's the DIU, the Navy Disruptive Capability Office, Indo-PACOM's Joint Mission Accelerator, etc. Or number 2, it's intervention of civilian authorities, sometimes assisted by military mavericks that push rapid adoption. In this case, it was Replicator, right? It was like, hey, Navy, you should have been doing this. Yes, the Navy already, kind of started stuff. It's not like it came out of the blue. But Kath Hicks just insisted, we bought this stuff for you. Use it.
Go faster. Yeah.
Right. Or new commercial vendors. Now we have Anduril, sail drones, Arconic, Capella Space, SpaceX, offer the DoD a new class of weapons outside of what the primes have been thinking about, and often at a radically reduced cost and speed for deployment. And then finally, the one I love is the 4th way that stuff happens is persistent effort of mid-grade officers. The best one was, for me, John Boyd, in the Air Force, who not only created the OODA loop, but I think his most interesting presentation was the be versus do presentation about what kind of career would you like. So that's just the setup, and I'm going to exhale for another part of the conversation if I can. Why once you know all that stuff, that is, disruption takes shape in multiple areas, from tech all the way to changing concepts of operation, to also changing business models. And how does it happen? Why is it slow? What gets in our way? And some is obvious to people listening, and some maybe not so obvious. And the one that's wasn't so not obvious to me, but actually might be one of the core problems was that we have trillions of dollars of legacy. And by legacy, I mean, gee, and I'm not picking on the Navy, but I'll pick on the Air Force as well. Carrier strike groups, for 75 years at $14 billion a pop, and then add the destroyers and whatever else, or man bombers. Let me pick on the Air Force, or whatever the historical investments have been. Um, so once you've built this model, this operating concept, and you invest in this stuff, just building and sustaining these existing assets leave little funds or even thinking for creation of new ones. What's worse is admitting that a major platform or weapon system is at risk or no longer effective is in any service considered heresy and likely the end of a career. Um, as a result, few leaders, let alone mid-level leaders, actively and rapidly seek out experiments and war games that test, new concepts against the old. It's kind of like the monkey see, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. On the other hand, China entered the 21st century with minimal investment in legacy, particularly in their navy, right? They had coastal defense stuff, but they didn't have a blue water navy. So now all of a sudden they were able to invest 100% of their assets in building something from scratch. So sometimes being the market leader, meaning you invested in X or Y, when a disruption happens or a new entrant happens that doesn't have your legacy, really turns out to be a hindrance. And this isn't a complaint, it's just a fact we ought to process, is that, having all these things that made enormous sense in the 20th century and still worked against non-nation states, we're not setting the pace here. But in fact, it hinders our thinking and the amount of money we spend. The second thing, which I kind of laugh about because I never quite understood this, we call it the frozen middle. Did you ever hear that term?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Frozen middle. These are individuals who seem to be resistant to change, but actually are the ones who control the paperwork and the process and whatever. Well, I spent some time actually reading about this, and we now know it occurs because of what's called the Semmelweis effect. And it turns out it's a normal human nature thing. It's an unconscious tendency of people to stick to their pre-existing beliefs and reject new ideas that contradict them, despite evidence in front of them. You could show them this and they go, that's nice, and continue on their way. And it turns out these group of people are not being venal or bad or whatever, but because it undermines their established norms and beliefs, it's a normal human reaction found in all organizations and walks in life. Um, but you know, uh, this limits learning and hinders the not only the mid, but the advice they're giving senior leaders, their ability to rapidly adapt to new circumstances. And the result is most often organizational blinders and denial to the facts in front of you. Now, what's interesting about that frozen middle is, if you remember how innovation happens, one of the areas it does come from is this middle. So there is a subsegment that have kind of taken I don't know, was it the red pill or the blue pill, that have woken up, but they face peers, right, focused on process and procedures, and they lack alternate places or organizations where the culture encourages and funds experimentation on new things. So number one was legacy. Number two was the frozen middle. Can I keep going, or is this?
You absolutely keep going, please.
So the third one I discovered is not unconscious, but conscious. And that's a kind of a Greek word or comes from the Greek, which is hubris. Large ego, it's a type of managerial behavior that's basically they're overconfident and complacent at the same time. I won't name the PEOs, but you could probably think of them, a ton of them. I mean, seriously, listen, I'm in charge. I know this, don't confuse me with anything, but it's about ego, not about, unconscious stuff. It's an active and conscious denial of facts. And the reason why is because I have to say this program's failing, boy, that threatens my job, right? And failure is not like, so I'm going to hide the salami under the rug, or I'll pass the problem on to the next person, or I'm not going to get promoted, or I might even get like court martial or dismissed. So that's a different problem, but it exists, and we could all point to things. The next one is, particularly in the DoD, we have very short tenure of leadership. Leaders of programs and commands are 2 to 3 year tours. Political appointees, if they're lucky, might do 4. Very rare did they do 8. This is really way too short to deeply understand and execute organizational change. It's okay if you just want to continue the last set of paperwork or process. Um, and then we lack a learning culture. There are no consequences or lessons learned for even the most egregious failures. I think I'm not saying anything new if we talk about Ford class carriers or F-35s or, shipbuilding delays or whatever. At a minimum, each failure should generate widely disseminated lessons learned written by the PAO and the contractor and approved by an outside board. And then we have perverse incentives. Career promotion in the services is driven by getting along with the status quo. Um, Pursuing existing force design and operating concepts when all available evidence suggests they're no longer viable, or selecting existing primes and contractors, or not pointing out that a major weapon system is no longer effective, or canceling a failing program, or not looking for new entrants who might be cheaper, better, more responsive. You're incentivized not to do that. Right? This is a
Very
get
much so.
and in fact, doing so is likely the end of a career. Few get promoted for those behaviors. This discourages non-consensus thinking. Yet disruption requires exactly this kind of behavior. And I only just got a couple more, but they should be intimately familiar with to your listeners, the revolving door.
Yeah.
So these perverse incentives are amplified by the revolving door with existing contractors. There are a few who are contemplating leaving the service and wanting a well-paying job with a contractor will hold them to account while in the service. And then you kind of go, well, where's the IG in the Justice Department? And the answer is they're also looking for a job. So this thing has this negative feedback loop. And then I'm almost done. The last one is the fact that we don't even have a language to differentiate between sustaining organizations that need to be fail-safe versus safe to fail, disruptive, rapid delivery organizations.
Yeah.
We just stand them up. We call them rapid capability offices, or we paint them black and we say it's in a SCIF or special access program. But literally, we seem to be incapable to holding 2 ideas in our head at the same time, that we need to build and innovate along sustaining systems like building better radars or next generation of ships, versus creating disruptive things that might actually obsolete some of those things. And those cannot exist in the same organization, yet we insist that they do. Because of course the sustaining folks are innovating. That is the nature of the game. But we don't actively seek out disruptive things. Oh, we have DARPA, we have whatever. But no, every service, Navy, Air Force, Army, ought to be thinking now that they need to be, and here's a fancy $40 word, ambidextrous, which means being able to chew gum and walk at the same time. We don't have that notion. Why? Because most of the leadership is not ambidextrous. They don't even understand the concept. Why? Not because, again, they're dumb, but they came up through an execution process world where, you just kind of turned the crank and things got better, etc. And if we were the only ones in the world, that would work. But that's not the world we face. And then I'm done almost with the last one, is that Congress politely has many incentives to support the status quo and few to change it. But the more direct thing is Congress is coin operated. For many congressmen, their goal is reelection, and that requires well-paying jobs for their constituents and raising funds for their next campaigns. And therefore, many of the decisions that appear in the NDAA and in appropriations are to support companies that provide the most jobs and the most funding for their re-election. Startups don't have that capability. And sometimes some of these disruptive things eliminate jobs. Boy, I don't care if it's going to defeat China, if it's going to defeat me as a congressman. I'm not sure which way I'm going to bet. And I'm not saying they're all venal and whatever, but that is a calculus we just ought to understand. The result is that many of them want to support the status quo rather than the nation. And that's a big idea. as long as we acknowledge that, we could kind of understand why don't these rational things get funded or end up at scale rather than we do innovation theaters that, we get to wave them around. See, we have a demo, isn't that great? But oh, look at that, it never made the pop. Well, why is that? Or made the NDA but never got appropriated. Why does that happen? Um, because we haven't been creative enough to figure out how, when we propose new disruptive things, to actually make it equally profitable for our existing industrial base to not lie down in front of the railroad tracks and try to kill it.
How do we
Because
align those incentives
right.
across both those constituencies? Yeah.
Now, there's a funny short story I'll tell you, which I keep coming back to. We're all familiar with container ships, right? You don't put cargo in the hold in bags anymore, which we used to, right? You could still watch movies about longshoremen and stevedores and whatever. But I was stunned when I read the history of container ships. Why wasn't there year-long strikes in the ports by the longshoremen to say, no effing way, where are we going to do this? It's going to put us all out of work, which it did. Do you know what the container ship guys did? It was
What's
genius.
that?
They did the math and said, do you know, it's like we could still be profitable if we paid the longshoremen not to work for the rest of their lives. And that's the deal they cut with the unions. For 30 years, those longshoremen showed up to hiring halls, and 95% of them didn't have any work, but they still got paid. And I'm using that as the extreme example of somebody who was very creative, that was trying to get a incredibly disruptive change into a system. And instead of saying, screw these guys, I don't care what your problem is, we're just going to containers and having year-long strikes or decade-long strikes, they just basically said, and buying them off is a little too extreme, but to the point, basically said, how do we make the system work for both ends? In this case, though, I believe the primes are essential to keep healthy, but not by building the things we don't need anymore, or the things it makes sense. So all this stuff, right? We all know each part of this, and your listeners could probably pile on to 5 or 10 more. But if we don't understand this as a stack of problems, and facing how do we get disruption through a system as built rather than the one we want, we'll never fix it. And there are some ways to fix it, and I'm happy to talk about those.
Yeah, that was going to be
but I'm going to let you have a word in your own podcast.
This is tremendous, and I think it was such an interesting way to walk across the different sort of levels, vertical and horizontal sort of juxtaposition of, some of this is maybe Pavlovian in nature. Some of this is a failure to steal the old Charlie Munger, right? Like always invert. But how do we bring in, the thinking and the change we want, absent understanding that sort of map you just walked us through? My sort of big question, and I'm going to mix it up. I usually ask that if you were king for a day, what's the one thing you change? What I'll say is, instead of that, if you'll humor me, is given sort of the seeming sort of like just mass and breadth of the challenge, the stack of problems. If you had, hey, you get the pitch one big idea, and that idea is going to work. What's your one big idea? What's your moonshot to get it, maybe bringing this all into the future, into the velocity, into the cyclical nature, the design that it needs to be?
Yeah, I wish I could give you one. I like some context. So let me remind you and your listeners, when do the services adopt disruptive change? It's not that we haven't. So number one is in a crisis, and it's an agreed upon crisis. December 7th, 1941, we went from projecting power with battleships to December 8th. We realized the Japanese just taught us that no, you project power with carrier strike groups. We were very quick learners, mostly because our battleships were in the bottom of Pearl. But seriously, right? In a crisis, when we understand it's a crisis, the problem, by the way, today is that if you go out to Hawaii and Indo-PACOM and further west, they understand it's a crisis. It's not clear that's understood in the 5-sided building in Washington in the Pentagon. If you go to the Red Sea, they understand it's a crisis, or you go to SAGU in Poland supporting, but it's not clear because leadership hasn't declared it a crisis yet. So one is crisis has to be nationally understood and articulated. Two is, believe it or not, inter-service rivalry
Oh yeah.
created disruption. So, in 1949, the Navy wanted to build super carriers to have a strategic bombing role with nuclear weapons. And there was basically the Secretary of Defense shut it down. That said, no, that's the primacy of the new Air Force. But the Navy became incredibly creative and created SSBNs, ballistic missile submarines, to say, no, 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 we could play in a way the Air Force can't. And by the way, it's more survivable than land-based missiles. And took decades before it actually got integrated into the PSYOP because they didn't quite count, and the Polaris wasn't that accurate at first, etc. But at least it created an impetus to come up with incredibly creative solutions. It was not only nuclear-powered subs, but solid fuel ballistic missiles fired from underwater, all kind of new concepts. Um, you know, the fourth is when leadership changes. It's kind of in the commercial world. If you want to get new thinking in a company that's heading in the wrong direction, you bring in a turnaround expert. Often not because they're smarter, but because they're not beholden to oh, this is our favorite project, or gee,
No organizational debt. There's no
right,
intellectual debt.
no mental debt, etc. So in the DoD, it's usually a new SecDef. It's an Ash Carter or Bill Perry or someone else who could see over the horizon versus just trying to manage the massive bureaucracy. Um, and so those are kind of the reasons. Sometimes it all happens at once. But now to your question, which I really do want to answer. This really requires now kind of leadership that just admits the world as it is, less so a process, and more so almost, I hate to say a memo, but what General Berger did, and obviously his staff did a lot of the work, was articulating Force Design 2030, started with a memo that acknowledged the world as it is and why we need change. We've failed to do that. We haven't even acknowledged that the world is no longer matched what we've designed for. And so I would start with a memo that says, one, let's articulate the need for change and what the change is and what we've learned and what no one wants to say out loud. Big idea that our current force design, whether it's Air Force or Army or Navy, is no longer sufficient to meet current and future threats. Now, that will make lots of primes panic, but it's not like we're going to shut them down. It's just saying what everybody else knows is that asymmetric threats require us to think about how we counter them, whether they're terror strike groups or whether they're drones on the battlefield with the Army or whatever. But the good news is we want to talk about, and this is what Berger did, it's not just I woke up this morning and thought about this, but we've actually run experiments and war games that point to a new model going forward that builds on our current assets. We're not going to throw them out, right? Our legacy actually is part of our strength, but innovates forward. And then asks for a commitment to move with urgency for deliverables, schedules, outcomes, and that make meaningful changes, supported by measurable goals and budgets. And then change the support processes. We can't have acquisition, talent, security, and policy as a one-size-fits-all. .MLPF is great for things that require 30 years. It's insane for attritable systems. It's insane for thinking, as an ambidextrous organization, you need policies and procedures that work for things that we're going to support for decades, but you also need the different policies that we need to deploy within, 24 months. And then finally, we need to change the requirements culture that assumes the problem is understood and therefore a solution could be specified in detail for everything. Some things you can, but in a transformed environment, we'll understand that many of our problems and solutions are just hypotheses, and we need to test and iterate and experiment before we lock down a requirement. Just imagine that Secretary of Defense or a service secretary had a memo that said these things, that said, the world tomorrow is now going to be a little different, and we're going to put together a transformation effort, not a, project X or Y, but we're going to transform our thinking. Don't panic. Your job is still in whatever, but we need to move and think in a different way because what we have ain't working, and its process, procedure, weapon systems, acquisition, etc., ain't working. And we're going to think about not willy nilly here. I think the burger model is a good one to study and adapt. Obviously, some things didn't work. He didn't. Obviously, in hindsight, I'd sure be talking to all the retired generals and admirals before he did this. I'd be doing a better job briefing all the staffers. I'd be calming down the primes about, no, we're not going to shut down Pascagoula or Groton. We'll still have shipyards, and we'll still have, Northrop Grumman. We'll still be building B-21s. But what else are we going to be doing, right? And how are you going to participate? And they still might hate it, but at least they'll understand that there's a vision here that doesn't just say there's a new shiny object here. We're actually trying to think about how to use our strengths, but figure out how to deal with the world as it is. Does that make sense at all?
Does it, right?
So if I had a
It's
magic
define the
wand, that
problem and some of that intellectual honesty required to just shine a light on it so that we can actually create space, and with that leadership led declaration, create the space for the great pockets to sort of float up and create, not psychological safety is an overused term, but
that's
set
exact. So
conditions.
all those mid-level, insurgents, we right now, we spend a lot of time doing innovation theater, meaning we admire problems and we have great demos, and maybe it shows up, as a proposed palm item, but never actually gets allocated or nothing
Yep.
really changes. And it's not that we're not changing. It's not all doom and gloom. These pockets of innovation are going to make a difference. The question is, are they going to make a difference in time and at the scale of the threat that we face, particularly in South China Sea, but in other parts of the world? And as I said, we're trying to do it with one hand tied behind our back because we're thinking of the DoD budget as a zero-sum game. And when you say where else you're going to get the money, and if you don't have that answer today, they dismiss it as, unlike entrepreneurs who go, well, that's a great problem. Let me go out of the building and start. No one's bothered to talk to the CFOs of every private equity company. No one.
Yeah.
And
I think that is the call to arms. The call to action is, hey, we need to ensure that all of the good things that are happening, we're creating an ability, we're setting conditions for the impact to matter, for the
yeah,
impact to transition into effect, an
yeah,
effect that is needed at the right time. And I think
yeah,
that is the goal of everything we're doing.
yeah. And so, on the geopolitical level, this is just what I'm talking about is inside the DoD. Part of the other question we've not been honest with the American people is, for Kuwait and Iraq and why we got mired in the Middle East was for oil.
Yep.
Well, I don't think I have to remind your listeners is that semiconductors are the oil of the 21st century. While our economy in the 20th century ran on petroleum, our economy in the 21st century runs on chips. And the whole issue about South China Sea, at least in my mind, is that over half of the logic chips, the things inside your computers, or more importantly, inside of weapon systems, things that do the thinking, whether they're microprocessors or others, are made by a single factory in Taiwan called TSMC. They don't make the machinery and they don't design the chips, but that's kind of where the factory churns them out. And that would be okay and was okay until China reminded the world that, oh yes, that place in Taiwan, that's in a province of ours that eventually we're going to take over.
Yep.
So now all of a sudden that the Western world is built on the 21st century version of oil, and China is not Iraq. They're in fact in the South China Sea. We don't quite honestly say this to American people, but we are the near peer competitor. China has overwhelming advantage in planes and ships and missiles and whatever. What are we going to do about it? And what happens? And that's why we did the Chip Act in the United States, is try to move some fraction of that production in time, that if Taiwan does fall and China captures that capacity, that we have some capacity in the United States to build that. But the other conversation is, well, if they blockade Taiwan, which likely, or actually try to invade, what will the Indo-PACOM do? And what will the president do for that? And that's this conversation of, the other surprise, I'm sure to a lot of people, was when the the Secretary of Navy just got the shipbuilding study that said things are 2 to 3 years delayed. We're not going to have new ships or subs, mostly in the South China Sea. And so we need to be a little more creative about what kind of disruptive things can we put out there. And I keep going back to how do we engage the whole of nation in doing this, whether they're startups, scale ups, money, etc., to actually provide a credible deterrent. General Mattis speaks in my class often, and one of the things that keeps sticking in my mind, which I was embarrassed I never quite understood, was his famous line about, every morning that he wanted Xi to wake up, the head of China, to say, "Not today." That is the best thing the military could do is to deter a war, right? If you have to win one, you've already lost because lots of
Right.
people die. But if you could deter one, um, and you do that by changing the calculus where they say, I don't think this is going to be effective, um, then
It's
you've
not
actually,
worth it. Yeah.
and I think we did that during the Cold War with a crazy strategy of mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons. Um, but we really want to and right now the calculus is not on our side. And so but the thing that just drives me crazy is that, um, here in Silicon Valley, we do have not the way to win the war, but a way to kind of change the calculus. And I think you're seeing some of that with the rise of Anduril and Palantir and SpaceX and Vanderveer Labs and a whole ton of other things that just wouldn't have existed unless we had this amount. So just as an aside, it's hard to imagine, but there's going to be $50+ billion this year invested in AI. Well, what's the DoD R&D budget? And
Yeah.
pick any service. Just in that one area, let alone
Yep.
autonomy. And that's just from venture capital, which historically doesn't invest tens of billions of dollars. That's what private equity does. But I mean, the amount of capital, the amount of innovation, the amount of like energy and by the way, passion, Silicon Valley has changed from this, oh, it's not our problem or whatever. Certainly after Snowden, it's turned 180 degrees. Um,
Very
you
much
know,
so.
it was already changing in its view of China, but boy, the invasion of Ukraine really put a dot on it. I mean, students now understand that other people are dying so they could sleep safely in their beds at night. That's a pretty amazing transformation. Obviously, not every student, every campus.
No, but
Right.
I think it's brought the communities closer together than they were historically.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's, 9/11 students, kind of a good number of them actually changed their mind and volunteered, and some of them are still in service. Um, but I've just palpable when we started hacking for defense now almost 9 years ago, I had armed guards from the campus security just to make sure I was going to have protests. And now the classes are 5 to 10 times oversubscribed. And there are now, defense things all across campus. Um, which is ironic because Silicon Valley was actually started by the defense and intelligence community. Just for your listeners, I'll put in a plug. If you go to my website, steveblank.com, you'll see a tab called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. And there's a story of how a single professor, basically, who built defense systems, got Stanford engaged and then created the entrepreneurship culture in the Valley. During the Cold War, every research university in the United States worked on weapon systems, and Stanford's expertise happened to be electronic warfare and electronic intelligence. So sorry, I got us off in a
No,
side.
don't. It's a reminder. I think it's an important reminder of, the power of, American exceptionalism and American ingenuity when we're working together and we're all oriented, at the right problems with the right incentives. And
Yeah,
I'll say, I think you and I could easily go on this for like another 4 hours. This is one of the most unique abilities to distill all of this down and make it easily consumable. And I know on behalf of the listeners, I want to say thank you for what you've done, the body of work throughout your career, and what it means to the country and the world, and then for taking some time to come chat with us today. I imagine you were going to get a bunch of follow-up questions from folks who want to learn more or engage. We'll push them to the website and to Hacking for Defense. But Steve, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks. This was fun, Tyler. I really appreciate you having me on.
Like, yeah.